All right. Can you sing them all? You singing the books of the Bible? Very good evening to everybody. Yes. He is? Okay. Just got word Mike Brown is very sick, so please keep Mike in your prayers. Okay. Once again, very good evening to everybody this evening. Glad to have you with us. We are starting a new quarter on this. We're now into March and a new quarter, so we're going to be starting some new classes. A lot of the children have changed their teachers and changed classes. The adults as well, having some new classes. And so this particular class on Wednesday night for the next 13 weeks is going to be a historical survey of the Old Testament. There's a whole lot to that. And how many books are in the Old Testament? 27, 29, going once, going, no, 39. 39, so 39 divided by 13. You see what we got here, we got to go pretty fast. And so, and really divided by 12 and maybe even 11 because usually you wind up missing at least one Wednesday or something. And then tonight we're going to do some introductory material. But I think you're going to find this useful. And this is just, like I said, it's an overview. I know that here at Margaret Street have studied the Old Testament for the last few years. And I know recently also, and been working, studying through the minor prophets and everything. And so they're more detailed lesson. That's not going to be this type of lesson. This is going to be an overview. And we're going to look at some things that perhaps you didn't know, or we're going to remind you of a few things that you already knew and just need to be reminded of from time to time. And so what we're going to do in this class is we're going to do an overview of the Old Testament. We're going to look at the arrangement and the chronology of how the Old Testament is put together, how it is laid out. We're also going to talk about dispensations and the history that's involved and where they line up in that history as far as our overview. We'll do that with a survey of each book. And so probably starting next week, we'll begin with Genesis. Depends on how it goes this evening. And each one of the books that we're going to go through, for every book we're going to go through, we're going to give you 20 questions. Remember that game, 20 questions? Well, we're going to give you one on the Old Testament books. So each time we start a new section of books, it's probably going to be 2 or 3 books per night. We'll give you, that'd be what, 60 questions if we do 3 books for you to study. I'll give you a large portion of the answers, but some of those answers you're going to have to look up yourself, and some of them you might already know. And so this hopefully will help us in our understanding of the Old Testament, help take off some of that worry that we have sometimes of trying to remember some of these things. How many have read through the Old Testament at least once? Wonderful. All right, we got a lot of hands up. Good. So you're familiar with, a lot of you are familiar with the stories, but there are many of us who haven't read through the Old Testament. And quite frankly, it can be a little bit intimidating, especially, that you start out in Genesis is so interesting and fun, and then you get into Exodus, and that's interesting, and then you get to the end of Exodus, and all of a sudden you get into all these details. And then you get into Leviticus, and you get into more details. And then you get into Numbers, and boy, you talk about detail. And then finally Deuteronomy. And then, boy, it starts picking back up. The gets real good action in Joshua. And then, boy, they start really, you get into the juicy stuff in Judges. And then you start getting into some other interesting history when you get into 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, and Chronicles. Then you look at the Chronicles and you think, well, why are we repeating the story here? And then, from that point on, other than the Ezra and Esther, and even those can be a little bit confusing, Nehemiah, as far as where they belong, and then you have all these other books, and then the prophets, and none of those are in in chronological order. And so they can get confusing of where all this fits in, and sometimes repetition and things like that, or where things fit. So hopefully this class will help you with that. All right, so an overview of the Old Testament. The word Bible means what? Does anybody know what the word Bible means? Books. It means books. So the word Bible means books. And the purpose of the Bible, the reason we have the Bible, is it is the story of redemption. Redemption history. You'll hear us say that sometimes, in the story of redemption history. And all the way from Genesis to Revelation is the story of redemption. And we're going to explain that in more detail as we go along. The purpose of the Old Testament. Now, the Old Testament itself is obedience. In the Old Testament, we see how God helps man understand obedience. Now, you could also put in there Romans 15:4, that it is for us, for those examples in our hope and assurance. But it helps us to understand obedience. All right? Then there's a theme of the Bible that we like to say, we like to use often. That theme being the Old Testament is about the Messiah is coming. The Messiah is coming. The entire Old Testament, mark my words, and we're going to look at this, Jesus Christ is on every page of the Bible. You're thinking, wait a minute, Jesus doesn't show up until Matthew. Well, actually, Jesus is right there on the first page, and He is there all the way to the end. The Bible is about Jesus, and you can find Jesus on every page of the Bible. And so it's the Messiah is coming. When you get to the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it is the Messiah is here. Jesus is here. And then Acts and the rest of the New Testament is Jesus is coming again. And that's just a synopsis, a theme, overall theme of the Bible. The Messiah is coming, the Messiah is here, the Messiah will return. If you want to make it very simple, we're going to do the same thing with each book of the Bible, giving you a one-word synopsis and things like that. All right, so looking at the Bible, there are basically three kinds of books. Three kinds of books in the Old Testament. There are what we call historical books, and there you can see all those listed, Genesis all the way down through the Kings and Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Then there are poetical books, sometimes called wisdom books. And those are Job and Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And then you have prophetical books. And those are all of your prophets that we have, beginning with Isaiah and ending in Malachi. All right, so those are basic, quick classifications of how you can classify the books of the Bible. Now, if you turn with me to Matthew chapter 22, Matthew chapter 22, verse 40, Jesus here in Matthew 22 has just quoted, has just said, back up just a little bit here, 22 verse 40, back up to verse 36, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? He said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now pay attention to verse 40. He says, On these two commandments depend all the law and prophets. No, Siri, I don't need to talk to you right now. Thank you. On these commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Now, what is Jesus talking about? This was a common way that the Jews would divide the Bible. They would call it the law and the prophets. And what they're talking about when they say the law, I'm sure many of you know this, and again, this could be a review for some of you, is we're talking about those first 5 books of the Bible. The books that, and they also call those the books of Moses, the law of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then the prophets. But when they say the prophets, they can include more than what we think. For example, you have Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Because those books have prophecy in them, and so they classify them that way, as well as the prophets, Isaiah. And then they have what they would call writings. Sometimes they would classify it that way. So what you're seeing on the screen is a Hebrew way of classifying or dividing the books. And if you do a little bit of study in history, you'll see that the Old Testament's been divided in different ways throughout the centuries until we get into the time of Christ, and basically the canon gets put together, still pretty much the way the Hebrews had it, with a few adjustments, and then the New Testament is added to that from the early church as what we have today. Now, what we have in our Bibles really is a division of 5. We have what we call the law, which is still part of history. And then we take those books that are just history and call them just history, and then poetry and prophecy. Some of you might remember this drawing that we had in our bulletin of several months ago, where we took a bookshelf and we just put those books up there, because that's what the Bible is. The Bible is a collection of books, just like a bookshelf. You're carrying a bookshelf in your hand whenever you carry the Bible around. You know, back before we had these electronic devices that we could read on, like the Kindles and things like that, the Bible was that library in your hand. And so if we zoom in on this a little bit, once again, you can just see those divisions. So the 5 books are called the Law of Moses. You'll hear it referred to that way many times. That's what they're talking about. It's also called the Pentateuch, okay, or sometimes they even refer to as the Torah. And so this is the Law of Moses. Then you have the history of Israel, and that literally recounts the history of Israel, how Israel became a nation, what happened to the nation, and all through the end until you get to Malachi, the end of it there. Then you have the books of wisdom that we talked about. It's also called poetry. And then those, what we call major prophets and minor prophets. Can anybody explain to me what a major prophet is versus a minor prophet? What's the difference between a major and a minor? You know this. What's the difference between a major prophet and a minor prophet? Words describe it. That's right, Jack. Exactly right. So what's he describing? Why is Isaiah considered a major prophet, and somebody like Micah is considered a minor prophet?
Did it have something to do with the tribes?
Nope, nothing to do with the tribes. There we go. There it is. The size of the book. All right, had nothing to do with how his rank in military, had nothing to do with how big he was, or had nothing to do with how important he was, or anything else. It had to do with the size of the book. Think about it. Isaiah is a big book, yes? 66 chapters. You get into Jeremiah and Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Those are all bigger books. Then you get into smaller books, and they're not in chronological order. They're in an order of a theme, and that's why it confuses people. And I want to talk about that just a little bit. Real quickly, a couple of things. When we talk about New Testament, does everybody recognize that a testament is a covenant? Remember what Jesus said in Luke, is it 22? Or was Luke 22, right? Am I quoting that right? Where he says, "This is the new covenant in my blood," whenever he's instituting the Lord's Supper. So it's a new agreement, a new promise. So that's why it's called the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the Old Promise. And we're going to talk about these promises when we get into Genesis, versus the new promise, which is what we have now in Jesus Christ. Now, unfortunately, there are people who do not make a difference, who do not know how to differentiate between the Old Testament and the New Testament, not recognizing that there is an old covenant, an old promise, and a new covenant, a new promise. And so they mix the two. And that's where we get into a lot of religious confusion because of mixing the two. I'll never forget, a friend of mine says, "Troy, we were at a opening of a denomination, and there was a band on stage, and there was fire and smoke and everything else, and they were playing music, and I was listening to them, and I was there for work. I wasn't there for any other reason. I was there for work. I installed the system. And my friend said, "Troy, you like music and you like all this stuff. I don't understand you Church of Christers. Why don't you have music in your church?" And I said, the same reason that, the reason we don't is because of what the Bible says. And he says, "Well, the Bible, says that David had instruments, And I said, he sure did. He sure did. But you know what? David also had sacrifices. So if you're going to have all this up here, where are your sacrifices? You need to have a little bit of blood flowing up there. And where's the guys who dress in all that apparel? Those priests and the high priests and the tabernacle and the temple and all those things. You're just taking a part of the Bible. And you're taking the Old Testament. And that's why it's called the Old Testament. You know, he didn't understand a word I said. Not a single word I said.
That's what most people do. They take parts of the Bible and they put it wherever they want.
That's exactly right. So it's really important to understand the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's some points in there. It has been nailed to the cross. The Old Covenant is no more because it is nailed to the cross. It says that in Colossians 2, verse 14. It's been fulfilled in Christ. Matthew 5, 17. It fulfilled its design. Its design was to lead us to Christ. Christ came. We no longer need the Old Covenant. So that's why we are now in the New Testament, and that's why we will always say we are trying to be the New Testament church. Have you ever noticed that? We don't ever say we're trying to be the church, well, we will say the church of the Bible, but we never say we're trying to be the church of the Old and New Testament. We always say the New Testament, and that's because there's a difference. All right. So any questions or comments up to this point? Yes? Yes, similar. What they had here is the former being former part of history, and then the latter part of history. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, they were all towards the latter part. After, and you'll see on the next one there it says pre-exilic. That's before they went into exile, and those that came after exile. All right? That's what that meant. That's a Jewish designation for those books. All right. One of the things that I wanted to clarify to help, and if you will just do a Google search, you'll find stuff like this very easily. If you get a Bible that's written in chronological order, you'll see this. But basically, this shows you where all of the books of the Bible fit in a timeline. We talk about this many times in our class on Sunday regarding the life of Christ, that we Americans and Western thinkers, we like to see things in a line, from the beginning to the end. All of our novels, all of our movies, all the things, even the way we talk, has a beginning and an end. It's linear. And so we expect everything to be that way. Then we get to the Bible, and we start reading, and when we get towards the latter books, it starts jumping all over the place, and we get frustrated and confused and don't know why. The reason why is because we can't think like a Westerner when it comes to the Bible. To understand it, you need to think like the people it was written for. And it was written for, in this case, the Old Testament, for the Israelites, for the Hebrews, for the Jews. And they classify things by theme, by topic. And so what they'll do is they'll place things, and that's why also you'll even read in Matthew and stuff, and it'll jump around a little bit. And have you ever read the book of Daniel? It jumps around from time frames, even in the book itself, because of that mindset of organizing by topic. And that's why the Bible is arranged as it is, and not in a chronological order. But there is a timeline that you can use. And this is showing you here, if you look, you'll see Genesis. Did you know that Job is actually the first book of the Bible written? Many people don't understand that Job, even though it's later in our Bible, it's actually as old as Abraham. And that was before Moses. And so who wrote Genesis, Exodus, Numbers? Moses. Was Moses there at the very beginning? No, he was there much later. And so Job is actually the first book of the Bible. It's the oldest book of the Bible. And it fits in, if you look at the timeline, it fits into the timeline of Genesis. That's why we've got it plugged in there. So you have Genesis, that is the beginning, and then it goes into Exodus, where they're coming. Exodus literally meaning Exodus out of, so they're coming out of Egypt, and you get into the tabernacle, and that's why you can plug Leviticus in at that same time frame, because it's all right there connected. And then Numbers is moving forward into the time frame, and then at the very end of Numbers you have Deuteronomy, where he recounts the law. From that point forward, you get into Joshua, where they cross over the Jordan and enter into the promised land, and they divide up the land. God gives them their territories, and then they settle down, and then everybody kind of forgets about God, and the period of the judges comes about. Well, during the judges, you can take the book of Ruth, and it's almost as if you're looking at this overall story of judges, and if we just want to hone in on one family and show their story, that's where Ruth plugs in. So Ruth plugs in into the time of judges. Then you get into 1 Samuel. What happens in 1 Samuel? The people start claiming or start wanting what? They want a king. And so, even though God tells them that you're going to forget me, He says, okay, I will anoint a king. So we have the kings that begin with Saul, then David and Solomon. Well, during that time, you can plug in Psalms, because that's whenever a lot of those were written, even though Moses wrote some of the Psalms. You'll notice that underneath 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, you have what? 1 and 2 Chronicles. That's because it's the same story, told in a different way. Just like you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John telling the same story of Jesus, but from a different perspective, right? Each one of those books tells about Jesus from a different point of view. Same thing with 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings versus 1 and 2 Chronicles. It tells it, 1 and 2 Chronicles tells it more from a spiritual point of view versus the other ones tell it from a more historical point of view. And then also, as you get into, and I love this is one of the things I really, I don't know how to describe this, is one of the things that shows me God's providence. What happens, what do you see plugging in to the end there, 2 Kings? All of a sudden, what do we have? At the top there, all of a sudden you have all these prophets. And, that's not by accident, folks. Here you have the history. Notice the history is going along, and you're going to see this in another slide in a minute. The history is going along, and everything seems to be okay. But as you get towards the end of 2 Kings, what's happening? God is telling them, you are disobedient, and I'm going to send you into captivity. I'm going to punish you if you don't get your act together. Right? That's the story. That's why all of a sudden you have prophets galore come onto the scene. One prophet after another of God saying, get your act together, repent, or I'm going to send you into punishment. And that's why you have those. Then, notice that space. You have that 70 years of exile. Well, during that time, when they're in Babylonian captivity, you have Daniel and Ezekiel. Daniel was in the, where? Where was Daniel? Who was he close to and prophesying to? Nebuchadnezzar. He's in the king. He's in the palace. Where's Ezekiel? He's out with the people, out in the country, out in with the people. And so you have God talking to both people in different places there. Then you have the return. And that's the story of Ezra first, and then Nehemiah, and then Malachi as a prophet tells a little bit more of the story to end it with. Notice once again in the story of Ezra, if you are right in that time frame, all right, that time frame of history, we've been moving along, and now we're in this history of Ezra where they're returning to Jerusalem. Once again, we're going to plug in and take out just a picture of one family. And that's where Esther gets plugged in. Does that help you understand the Bible a little more about how it's set up in a chronological form? Have you ever seen it like this before? Oh, good. So hopefully this will help you. Like I said, if you just do a quick search, this is easy to find. Or if you can't find it, you come see me and I'll make you a copy of this or something so you can have it. But that's basically in a nutshell how the Bible is organized as far as a chronological timeline, the way we Americans would look at it. All right. There's another way, and I know you can't really read that because it's a lot of type and in a small space. But there's another way you could divide into historical periods of the Bible. And what you have are 15 different periods. And these periods are, and I'll just read them, so if you can't read them, is the antediluvian period. Anti as in before. What is diluvian? What does that mean? Flood. Before the flood. And then number 2, post-diluvian, after the flood. Then after the flood, you get into what's called the Abrahamic period, time of Abraham. Then you wind up in the bondage in Egypt whenever Joseph and his family, Abraham and his family all wind up down in Israel, and they wind up in bondage, and then they come out. Then the next one is the wilderness wanderings. And then the next period is the conquest of Canaan. Now, doesn't this sound like typical history? I mean, you think about American history. When we talk about the colonial period, what are we talking about? The colonies. Colonial colonies. You're a sharp one, Jim, I'll tell you. We're talking about American Revolution, things like that, right? 1700s, the signing of the Declaration of Independence and all that stuff. All right, we get into postmodern period. What are we talking about? Well, it's a little more difficult, isn't it? Anybody know? I see Richard's lips moving back there. Yes, right around post-World War II. Then there's other time periods, and we have these names. What's the age that we're in now? A lot of people like to use. There's kind of a little bit of confusion there. What's the age we're in now? The what? I don't know. I like to call it the selfie age, but we're in the communication age, all right? The computer or communication age.
We're in the wife's age.
The what?
The wife's age.
I did not ask your wife's age. I did not. I did not. Okay. So then number 7, you get into the judges. Number 8, the United Kingdom. You'll hear those terms. The kingdom is united. That's whenever you have Saul, David, and Solomon under one big kingdom. And then, remember, Solomon's sons divided the kingdom. So you had 2. You had the north and south kingdom. Then you wind up, number 10 here. And I've seen these listed in different ways. But here you have what's called the kingdom of Judah. After Israel gets carried off, now you're in a different time frame. Then you wind up in Babylonian captivity time frame. Then the restoration of the Jews when they come back to Israel. And then you get into this is the entire Bible. You get into the intertestamental period. Some of you who are in our the Life of Christ class, we studied that intertestamental period, that 400 years of silence. And then you get into the life of Christ, that number 14, and then finally what we're in now, the Christian age. Now there's another way, an easier way of looking at this. Have any of you ever heard of or seen a dispensation chart? A few people, okay. What's a dispensation? Period of time. In this case, a period of time, and a specific period of time of some specific things. And the Bible can be divided up into 3 periods called the patriarchal age, the Mosaical age, and the Christian age. And each one of those, that age in general has their specific details, and within that age have smaller ages or epochs, if you will, eras. And so we're going to look at some of these real quick. So that first one, the patriarchal age. What do we mean by patriarchs? What? What was that? The fathers, okay? Talking about fathers, patriarchs. And who is the father of the human race? Adam. And so Adam is there. And this age begins with the defining moment for this age. That's why you'll see that little globe up there, is creation. And so, and this age begins with the creation. Adam is the father of this age. And so within this, you have certain periods. All right? And inside these periods, you have that time of the Garden of Eden, when the man is in the Garden of Eden. Are we still in that age? No, that age, that era ended. That's why it's a circle. So that means when you see a circle, a complete circle, it means that era is over. It's done, because you have the fall of man, and so you wind up here whenever man becomes wicked. And so this is even divided, this age right here, when you have the story of Cain and Abel and the things that happened there, and then how man's desire and leanings was always on wickedness. And then you get into Noah, and then you cross over into, there's the flood, that represents the flood. You cross over into another era. After Noah now becomes the father of the nations. And you wind up in another era, which is the Abrahamic era. Now, there's a couple of ways of looking at this. I have these in 2 different circles because Joseph dies, and that era is over. And then you enter into what I call the slavery or the time of Egypt, the Egyptian bondage. But some people will take and put those two together. In other words, it's still part of the Abrahamic era, and it's an era within an era, a time period within a time period. And so this is the patriarchal. Well, as you move through the Bible, do they stay there? No. You get into Exodus. That's just Genesis. And this time frame is a time frame whenever, just like Hebrews 1:1 says, God spoke directly to the patriarchs. You think about it. God speaking directly to Adam? Yes. To Abel and Cain? Yes. And he continued that. Did he speak directly to Noah? Yes. Noah used gopher wood. And so he spoke directly to them. During this time, you also have animal and harvest sacrifices. The first sacrifice we see is Genesis 4, 3 and 4, and then also in Genesis 22:2 when Abraham is commanded to go take up Isaac to sacrifice him, and he already has that in his mindset. God's going to provide a sacrifice. So that's this sacrifice that's going on in this age, and it was a family religion. The religion is of God. It's a family religion. Then you move over the Red Sea. You notice that there's always moving over a body of water. You're going to see that in each age. And in this age, you move into, and the defining moment is Mount Sinai, whenever Moses receives the law. And so now we've entered into a whole new era, a whole new dispensation. God is now changing the rules, if you will. First, he talked directly to the patriarchs. Now he talks through Moses and the law. And so things are changing. And in this time, you have God speaking directly to Moses. The law came by Moses, it says in John 1:17. Still have animal and harvest sacrifices, which are all part of the law. You have now the Passover has been commanded in Exodus 12 and 20, where you're commanded to take a rest. And then you have a high priest, a representative of God. And during this period, you have a lot of ups and downs. You have some good periods and some bad periods. When they were in the wilderness, was that a good period? No, they were grumbling and having problems. But then when Joshua comes along, how did Israel look during that time? They were doing well. They were strong and mighty, and they conquered the land. All right, then you go into the period of the judges. So each one of these periods, you see the little circles? Each one of those comes to an end. So now you're in the judges, and you have all this debauchery and these things that are happening. But even that period ends, and they go into the kings, the united kingdom. And then you wind up into the divided kingdom. So these up and down periods. All right, and all of those are pointing to the messianic prophecy, all pointing to Jesus. And you'll notice that it says in there, ministry of Christ. Jesus Christ lived under what dispensation? The Mosaic. We often forget that. And that's why sometimes people want to include the gospel accounts with the Old Testament, because Jesus lived under the Old Testament. Well, we can understand that argument, and that's really not a bad argument, but it's fine the way it's divided as far as the New Testament, because you're telling that story and it was all leading to that. And there's different arguments in regards to that. So you have the birth of Christ, again, another era that comes to a close. But this general dispensation comes to a close once again by passing over water. This time it's the cross and baptism. And through that cross, now we pass over into what is called the Christian age. Now notice that the Christian age, that big circle, is not complete. Right? The other circles were complete because they've come and they've gone and they're finished. But is the Christian age over? All right, so there you go. So therefore, we are in that. But there is an era that has come, a time period that has come and gone. A lot of people don't seem to understand this. The Bible's very clear. And that is the apostolic period. The time whenever the Bible was being written, the apostles had miraculous powers and things like that, and prophecy and speaking in tongues, but that period has come to an end. That's a whole other study I wish we had time for. But you see, all of this, and by the way, that defining moment for this period is the Bible. We now have the Bible in our hands. So first we had creation. First we had creation and the patriarchal period. Then we had, do I have that next? Let me go back one. There it is. Patriarchal age. And then we cross over water to get into the Mosaical age. Then we cross over water again. Now we're in the Christian age. And in this Christian age, lastly, God speaks now, Hebrews 1:1, through who? Jesus, through the Word. And the law was abolished. All that Old Testament was abolished. The law was a schoolmaster. And now we have once and for all a sacrifice. No more animal sacrifices or harvest. But Jesus' sacrifice. We worship in spirit and truth, and grace and truth by Christ. So there's a quick overview of the Old Testament. We have just a little bit more we're going to cover next week. And then we're going to get into Genesis and start answering all those questions. And we are out of time. Thank you so much for your attention.